My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 32 years old. And on a Saturday evening in September, at a birthday dinner I had organized, decorated, catered, and paid for entirely by myself, my husband's family stood up and announced that he was leaving me to go back to the woman he'd been married to before he ever met me. I found out the same moment everyone else did. I was standing at the kitchen counter of my father-in-law Gerald's house, refilling the bread basket, when I heard Gerald's wife Patricia tap her fork against her wine glass and say, loud enough for all 14 guests to hear, "We have some exciting family news to share." I walked back out holding the bread basket. I was still holding it when she finished talking. I want you to understand what that moment looked like. There was the dining room table I'd dressed myself that morning. The flower centerpiece I'd driven 40 minutes to pick up because the florist Patricia liked only did same-day pickup. The catered food from the Italian place Gerald had mentioned once, in passing, back in April. The birthday cake in the kitchen, 3 tiers, his name written in the handwriting style his daughter had described to me in a 30-minute phone call because I wanted to get it exactly right. There were 14 people in that room who knew what was happening. 14. I was the 15th. And I was the one holding the bread. I need to take you back to the beginning, because what happened that Saturday didn't start on that Saturday. It started 5 years earlier, in a hospital waiting room, on the worst night of Gerald Mercer's life, when I was the only person who showed up. Before we go on, please subscribe and like this video, my dear listeners. Your support motivates me to tell even more engaging stories. I met my husband, Daniel Mercer, at a conference in Austin. He was presenting a panel on supply chain logistics, not exactly the most romantic origin story, but I've always believed that love finds you in the ordinary places, not the cinematic ones. Daniel was smart and funny and a little tired in the way that interesting people often are. He'd been married before, briefly, to a woman named Sylvia. They'd been together 3 years, married for 1, and then she'd left without much explanation and without looking back. When he told me about Sylvia on our 3rd date, he described it the way you'd describe a car accident you'd survived. A fact, not a wound. I believed him. I was 26 and optimistic in the specific way that 26-year-olds are, which is to say that I hadn't yet learned how to read the things people don't say. We dated for a year. Then we got engaged. Then we got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Virginia, and I became Claire Mercer, and I thought, in the uncomplicated way that brides sometimes do, that I had found my home. What I had actually found was a second job. The Mercer family was not unkind in the way that villains are unkind. They were unkind in the way that families are when they've decided, without ever saying it aloud, that someone doesn't quite belong. Gerald and Patricia Mercer had been married for 39 years. They had 2 children, Daniel, 34, and Kristen, 30, who lived in Charlotte with her husband and their twin boys. They had a dog named Biscuit who barked at me every single time I walked through the front door for 3 years straight, until one afternoon I sat on the floor and let him sniff my hand for 20 minutes, and after that he stopped. Nobody ever commented on that shift. Nobody ever asked what I'd done differently. That was about right for the Mercer family. I was confident, and they were grateful for my confidence, and that was the extent of what passed between us. When Daniel and I came for Sunday dinners, which we did nearly every week for 5 years, at Patricia's standing request, I was the one who remembered to ask about Gerald's knee surgery, who knew that Kristen's oldest was going through a difficult year in school, who tracked Patricia's preferred wine and brought a bottle every single time without being asked. I did these things because I loved my husband and I wanted his family to be my family. It is embarrassing, in hindsight, how long it took me to understand that wanting something very sincerely and deserving it are not the same thing. The first real crisis came about 8 months into our marriage, when Gerald had a cardiac event, a minor one, as cardiac events go, but frightening in the way that anything involving a 63-year-old man's heart is frightening. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. Daniel was in Denver for work. Kristen was in Charlotte, 3 hours away. Patricia was with a friend at a spa in the mountains, somewhere without consistent cell service. I got the call from the hospital because Daniel had listed me as an emergency contact for his father, something he'd done when we got engaged and then, I think, forgotten about. The nurse on the phone was calm and clinical. Gerald had experienced chest pain and was being evaluated. Someone should come. Would I be able to make it? I drove directly from my office to St. Michael's Hospital. I sat in the waiting room for 2.5 hours with a cup of terrible coffee and a magazine I didn't read. When the cardiologist came out to give an update, I was the one who listened, who asked the right questions, who wrote down the medication names and the follow-up instructions in a notes app on my phone. When Patricia finally arrived, her friend had driven her 3 hours from the mountain spa, her hair still half done from the interrupted service. I met her in the corridor and walked her through everything calmly, the way you would want someone to walk you through something frightening. She hugged me. It was the only time she ever hugged me. She said, "Thank you, Claire. We're so lucky you were here." I drove home at 11:30 that night and cried in my car in our driveway for 10 minutes, not because of anything bad, but because of the specific exhaustion of holding yourself together for other people. Daniel called me from Denver when I was already in bed. He said he owed me one. I said family didn't keep score. He said he knew. He said he loved me. I believed both of those things. Gerald's recovery required more than the cardiologist had initially expected. He had follow-up appointments, dietary restrictions, a physical therapy regimen for the secondary effects of his blood pressure medication. He also, as it turned out, was a stubborn and somewhat difficult patient who didn't take well to being managed by Patricia, who he'd been managing all of his own and her worries for 39 years. He took well to me. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because I didn't fuss. Maybe because I asked him questions about his life before the crisis, about the contracting business he'd built from nothing in the early 80s, about the house he'd built with his own hands in West Virginia before moving the family to Virginia. Maybe because I listened without half of my attention on something else. Whatever the reason, I became Gerald's unofficial point person for medical logistics in the months after his cardiac event. I made the follow-up appointments. I organized his medications. I drove him to cardiac rehab on the Tuesday mornings when Patricia had her women's Bible study group, because it had never occurred to anyone to rearrange Patricia's schedule instead. I did not suggest rearranging Patricia's schedule. That is important. I am not telling this story to position myself as a martyr. I am telling it exactly as it happened. I drove Gerald to rehab on Tuesdays. We would get coffee afterward from a drive-thru. He was a black coffee person, no exceptions, and he would talk about the contracting business, about a cabin he'd always wanted to build in the Blue Ridge, about Daniel as a boy, stubborn and sensitive in the specific way that children who will eventually be kind adults often are, about Sylvia. He didn't say it like it was information. He said it like it was a long conversation he was continuing with himself, and I happened to be in the passenger seat. She was a good girl, Sylvia. Just not right for Daniel. Not ready, maybe. Some people need more time to figure out what they need. I nodded. I asked if he took sugar in his coffee, even though I already knew the answer. He said, Daniel took it hard when she left. Harder than he let on. I nodded again. He seems happy now, Gerald said. And then he looked at me, and I thought he was going to say something that would make me feel, briefly, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. He said, "You're good for him. Good for the logistics." I drank my coffee. I drove him to rehab. I did not think about the word logistics again for another 3 years, when I finally understood what he had meant by it. The years between Gerald's cardiac event and his 65th birthday were busy in the way that years are when you are trying to build a life, while also maintaining everyone else's. Daniel traveled frequently for work. His role had expanded to managing logistics partnerships across 3 time zones, which meant Denver and Seattle were nearly as familiar to him as our own neighborhood. I worked as a project manager for an architecture firm, which is a job that asks you to hold 12 things in your head simultaneously and to do so with a pleasant expression, and which I had turned out to be extremely good at. I used those same skills at home. I organized the Christmas gatherings at our house, which had started as a small thing Daniel and me, Gerald and Patricia, Kristen and her husband and the twins, and expanded, the way family gatherings always do, to include Daniel's aunt and uncle from Ohio, Gerald's brother from Tennessee, Kristen's in-laws who had nowhere else to go one particular year and then became a permanent fixture. I organized Kristen's baby shower when she was pregnant with the twins because she was overwhelmed and Patricia was in denial that her daughter needed help. I planned it, sent the invitations, rented the venue, coordinated with Kristen's friends in Charlotte who I had never met in person. I sat at the edge of the party, because it was Kristen's day, and I watched the Mercer family move through the space I had created for them, and I felt, mostly, the quiet satisfaction of having done a thing well. Kristen thanked me. She was always the most generous of the Mercers when it came to gratitude. She had a straightforwardness that I admired. She said, "I don't know how you do it, Claire. You're like the family engine." I said I was happy to do it. She said, "I know you are. That's the thing. But I don't want you to be the only one who is." I thought about that for a long time after. I thought she was telling me something real. I thought it was going to lead somewhere. It didn't, quite. In the spring before Gerald's 65th birthday, I began noticing things. Daniel was on his phone more. This is not by itself unusual. Daniel had always been a person whose phone was attached to him, whose work followed him into rooms and meals and weekends. But this was different in a way I couldn't immediately name. The angle of his body when he typed. The way he would finish a message and exhale, and I would ask what he was working on, and he would say something for Seattle or a logistics thing in a tone that didn't quite land. I am a project manager. I notice when things don't land. I also noticed small absences that were not quite absences. The Sunday dinners where he sat beside me and was slightly elsewhere. The weekend morning where he woke up early and when I asked what he was doing, he said he couldn't sleep and went to the kitchen, and I heard him talking in a low voice on his phone for 40 minutes. I told myself it was work. Denver had a different time zone. There were always reasonable explanations, and I kept finding them because the alternative required me to sit with something I was not ready to sit with. I noticed that when I talked about the future, a trip we discussed taking to Portugal, a question about whether we wanted to put in the deck we'd been talking about for 2 years, he would agree pleasantly, and then the conversation would simply not continue. Not because he objected. Just because his attention was elsewhere, and I kept being careful not to press on things that felt fragile without being sure why they felt fragile. He also began initiating conversations about the future with a kind of vague anxiety that felt new. Not what we were building, specifically. Just, what did I want? Where did I see myself? Did I ever think about whether we were happy? I said yes, I thought we were happy. He said, "I think you deserve to be happy." I said, "I am happy." He said, "Good. That's good." I knew, somewhere in the part of myself that I had gotten very good at not listening to, that this was not a conversation about whether I was happy. It was a conversation about whether he was. And he was asking me to give him something, absolution, maybe, or permission, or just the confirmation that I could not see what was actually happening. And I kept giving it to him because I loved him, and because the world was easier if things were simply fine. Patricia called me in July to ask if I'd given any thought to Gerald's birthday. I said I had it handled. She said, "Oh, wonderful, I knew you would." She did not ask what I had in mind or whether she could contribute or whether I needed any help at all. She said wonderful and moved on to something about Kristen's twins, and I wrote down Italian restaurant, private room, call florist on the notepad I kept on my desk at home, because that is how I handled things. Quietly. Efficiently. Without asking anyone to notice. But I had a birthday dinner to plan. Gerald was turning 65, and Patricia had mentioned in March that she wanted it to be special, something memorable, and then she had not mentioned it again, and the calendar kept moving. And when August came, I realized that nobody had made any arrangements at all. I made the arrangements. I called the Italian restaurant Gerald had mentioned once, in April, and I reserved the private dining room for a Saturday evening in September. The woman who answered the phone had a brisk efficiency that I appreciated. She told me the room held up to 20, that the prefix was the simplest route for larger groups, that they could accommodate dietary restrictions with 48 hours notice. I gave her everything she needed. I organized the guest list, 14 people, and sent the invitations, Physical ones because Gerald's generation still noticed the difference. And Patricia had once mentioned that nobody sent real invitations anymore, and she'd said it with the specific wistfulness of someone who missed a thing and hadn't thought to ask for it. I ordered the flowers from the florist Patricia preferred, a woman named Ellen who ran a shop 40 minutes from my house and didn't do online orders. I called Ellen on a Tuesday morning and described what I was looking for: autumn colors, nothing too formal, something that felt like the inside of the kind of home Gerald would want to sit in, and Ellen said she'd have to do same-day pickup, which meant a 40-minute drive, and I said that was fine. I ordered the cake from a bakery that Gerald's sister-in-law from Tennessee, a woman named Ruth Ann, had mentioned at the previous Christmas. Ruth Ann was one of those people who remembered things about food with a specificity that bordered on devotion. She had mentioned the bakery in the context of its handwriting work. They could replicate almost any script in icing, which she'd had done for her husband's 40th with his actual signature. I had filed that away in the part of my mind where I kept things that might be useful. I called Kristen's oldest son, Gerald's grandson James, 13 years old and extremely serious in the way that 13-year-olds who've been told they're mature for their age often are, and I explained what I needed. James spent 30 minutes describing his grandfather's handwriting to me with a precision that was genuinely touching. He said things like the G has a loop that goes down further than most Gs, and he lifts his pen before he writes the D. You can see the tiny break in the line. I relayed all of this to the bakery. The result was a 3-tiered cake with Gerald written across the top in pale blue icing that looked, unmistakably, like his own hand. I paid for all of it. This is not something I advertised. It is simply something I did, the way I had been doing things for 5 years, because I had understood early that the Mercer family was better at enjoying things than at creating them, and I had made my peace with being the person who created. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things in those years that turned out not to be true. The dinner was going well. Gerald was in good spirits. It was his birthday, after all, and he had the particular glow that men of a certain age get when surrounded by people who are glad they're still alive. Patricia was seated at the far end of the table, next to Gerald's brother Raymond, and she was doing the thing she did at gatherings where she became slightly theatrical, laughing a little too warmly at small jokes, touching people's arms to emphasize points. Kristen sat across from me with her husband Marcus. The twins were with Marcus's mother for the weekend. Kristen kept catching my eye across the table with the particular look that means you did good, and I kept doing the slightly modest look that means thank you, it was nothing, which was a performance we had both perfected. Daniel was at the other end of the table from me, next to his father. They were talking, I could see them, though not hear them, and Daniel had the look on his face that he got when he was being serious in a way that he was slightly nervous about. I thought, he's probably talking about Gerald's blood pressure. He'd been worried about it since a checkup the previous month. I thought, I should refill the bread. I went to the kitchen. I picked up the bread basket Patricia had bought specifically for this dinner. She had texted me a photo of it in the store to see if I thought it was nice, and I had said yes. That's beautiful, and I refilled it from the loaf I'd wrapped that morning. Then I heard the fork tap against the glass. Patricia stood up. She was smiling the way she smiled in Christmas card photos, slightly posed, the smile of a woman who knows this moment will be remembered. She said, "We have some exciting family news to share." I walked out of the kitchen with the bread basket. She said, "As many of you know, Daniel has been doing some real soul-searching this past year. And we couldn't be more proud of him for having the courage to follow his heart." I stood still. She said, "Sylvia and Daniel have found their way back to each other, and Daniel will be moving back to the city at the end of the month. We are so grateful that this family is becoming whole again." Kristen's head turned toward me so fast that I saw it in my peripheral vision. Marcus made it sound like someone who has just set something down that was heavier than expected. Gerald looked at his plate. Daniel looked at me, and I looked at Daniel, and I held the bread basket, and I did not cry, and I did not say anything, and I did not move. 14 people in that room. All of them watching the 15th. I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I did not feel surprised, precisely. I felt the specific sensation of a thing you have half known for a long time finally acquiring its correct shape. Like when you've been carrying a word on the tip of your tongue for hours and someone else says it and you think, yes, that's it. What I had been carrying was the knowledge that something was wrong. What I now had was its name. I set the bread basket on the table. I said, "Excuse me." I walked to the bathroom at the end of the hall. I closed the door. I turned on the tap. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time, the way you do when you are trying to assess whether the person looking back at you is going to be able to function. She was. She wasn't happy about it, but she was. I turned off the tap. I dried my hands. I opened the door. Kristen was standing in the hallway. She said, "Claire." I said, "I'm fine." She said, "You're not." I said, "No, but I will be." She reached out and took my hand for a moment, and then she let go, because she knew me well enough to know that what I needed was not to be held together by someone else's hands. What I needed was to get through the next hour under my own power, and then I could fall apart in the privacy of my own car. She nodded. I walked back to the dining room. I sat down at the table. I finished the dinner. I want you to understand what finish the dinner means, because I think people sometimes hear those words and imagine something small. I finished the dinner means that I sat at that table for 90 more minutes. I answered questions when people spoke to me. I laughed at one of Raymond's jokes because it was actually funny and because my sense of humor, apparently, did not shut down when the rest of me was trying to quietly collapse. I cleared the salad plates when Patricia suggested clearing the salad plates. I brought out the birthday cake. I stood at the head of the table, the head that is actually the far end, where the person who organized everything always ends up standing, slightly outside the frame, and I lit 65 candles. Which takes longer than you would think. Gerald looked at the cake. He looked at the handwriting on it, which was his own handwriting in pale blue icing, and his face went through something complicated. He said, "Who did this?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew who had arranged the handwriting specifically. I said, "Your grandson helped me describe it to the bakery." Gerald looked at me. He did not say anything. The room sang happy birthday. He blew out 65 candles. I cut and served the cake. Then I found Daniel in the kitchen, where he had retreated while the cake was being distributed, and I said, "I'm going to go. I'll call you tomorrow about logistics." He said, "Claire, I'm sorry. I should have told you before." I said, "You should have. But this isn't the time." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm cutting your father's birthday cake. I'll be okay when I'm done cutting your father's birthday cake." He didn't say anything else. I finished cutting the cake. I said goodbye to Gerald, who was the only person in the room I could look at without something in my chest getting tight. He said, "Claire." Just my name. I said, "Happy birthday, Gerald." I drove home. And then, sitting in my car in the driveway of the house Daniel and I owned together, I cried for exactly as long as I needed to, and then I stopped. The weeks that followed were a logistical process, because everything becomes a logistical process when you're good at logistics and you don't want to be alone with your feelings. Daniel and I had the conversation we needed to have. It was civil. We were, fundamentally, civil people, which is both a quality and a limitation, and it confirmed what I already knew, that he and Sylvia had reconnected the previous spring. That the year of vague conversations about the future had been his circling something he couldn't quite say, that he was sorry, genuinely, he said, for how it had come out. I asked him if his family had known. He paused just long enough. I said, "So Gerald knew." He said, "They all wanted to." I said, "That's enough." I understood, then, the shape of the past 5 years. The dinners I'd cooked. The appointments I'd kept. The gatherings I'd organized. The bread basket. The birthday cake. I had not been wrong to do any of it. I want to be clear about that. I had done those things out of love for Daniel and for a version of a family I had genuinely wanted. But I had also done them for people who had always understood, somewhere beneath the gratitude, that I was good for the logistics, and that when the logistics were no longer needed, the contract would simply end. Gerald had told me who I was to them in that hospital parking lot, 3 years before the birthday dinner. You're good for him. Good for the logistics. I had filed that away in the part of my mind where I kept things I didn't want to examine. 3 months later, I was sitting in the office of a mediator named Patricia, different Patricia, a Patricia with good posture and a diploma's wall that looked like a grid, going through the house. The mediator had the particular quality of stillness that people develop when they spend their days sitting in the middle of other people's pain without flinching. She didn't take sides, that wasn't her job, but she was efficient in the way that told you she'd heard every argument and was waiting for people to get to the ones that actually mattered. We had bought the house 4 years earlier. My credit rating had secured the mortgage. I had spent 2 years building it from the modest inheritance my own grandmother had left me, quietly, while Daniel was building his career and his portfolio of unexamined feelings. My down payment had been larger. My salary had been the primary one during the first 2 years, while Daniel's salary was largely redirected toward paying down the business debt he'd accumulated before we met. A fact I had known about before we got married and had accepted without making it transactional, because that was the kind of thing you did when you love someone. My attorney, a woman named Diane Rice who wore excellent blazers and had the calm energy of someone who had heard every variation of this story and was still, sincerely, on your side, had reviewed everything thoroughly. She had a way of presenting information that made it feel like facts rather than grievances. She did not editorialize. She said, "The financial record is clear. We should be straightforward about what you're entitled to." I had gone into that room expecting to fight for things and come out with less than I deserved, the way you do when you've been conditioned to take the smaller portion and tell yourself you don't mind. I did not come out with less than I deserved. Diane had made sure of that. Daniel had not contested much. He had the look, during those meetings, of a man who was genuinely ashamed and also genuinely hoping to get through it as quickly as possible, and those two things sometimes work in your favor. He agreed to things I had not expected him to agree to. He apologized 3 times in one meeting in a way that was real enough that I didn't want to dismiss it, but that also arrived too late to change anything. I took the house. I took the settlement. And I took something Diane said to me at our last meeting, after the paperwork was signed and we were standing in the parking lot in the November cold, and she said, "Claire, I've been doing this for 16 years. Some people walk out of those rooms still shrunk down from what happened to them. You're not that person. Don't let yourself become that person." I said, "I don't plan to." She said, "Good. Because the people who come in here having done the most, having given the most, who are the most clearly in the right, those are the ones who sometimes have the hardest time letting themselves have what they're owed. Don't do that to yourself." I thought about that for a long time. What I walked out of that building with was the house itself, a settlement, and something more important than either, the clarity that comes when you stop spending your energy on people who are grateful for your effort without being curious about your worth. I want to tell you about what happened the following spring, because this is not a story that ends in the house or the settlement or the divorce. This is a story about what you can build when you finally stop building for other people. I had always been good at my job. I want to be clear about that, not as a boast, but because it matters. I had spent 10 years at the architecture firm being good at my job, managing projects with multiple stakeholders and competing priorities and budgets that kept shifting. And I had done it well and been recognized for it, and then used exactly those same skills at home for 5 years and received, in exchange, the role of family engine. The difference between those two contexts is that in one of them, someone was paying attention. My firm's founding partner, a woman named Josephine Park who had started the company in 1998 and grown it to 60 people, asked me to lunch in January. She said she'd been watching my work for 3 years and wanted to discuss a partnership track. A partnership track. I said I was interested. She said, "I want to make sure you're ready for the visibility. Some people who are very good at their jobs are more comfortable behind the work than in front of it." I thought about the birthday cake. I thought about 65 candles, lit by someone standing slightly outside the frame. I said, "I've been behind things long enough. I'm ready to be in front." She nodded, the way people nod when they've asked a question they already knew the answer to. The partnership conversation took 6 months, as those conversations do. But it began in January, 3 months after the dinner, and it moved forward, and by the following September, 1 year after the birthday dinner, I had a title on my office door that said Associate Partner, Project Development. Now I need to tell you about the call I got in October, 14 months after the birthday dinner. It was Gerald. He called on a Tuesday, which was the day we used to drive to cardiac rehab, and for a moment when I saw his name on my phone I thought, his heart. Because that is the first place my mind goes when a 65-year-old man calls unexpectedly. But his voice was steady when I answered. He said, "Claire, I'm glad you picked up." I said, "Is everything okay? Are you?" He said, "I'm fine. Physically. I'm fine." I waited. He said, "I wanted to call and tell you something that I should have said a long time ago. And I need you to let me say it without interrupting because I'm not going to be able to do it twice." I said, "Okay." He said, "You were good for this family. Not for the logistics. For the family. The distinction matters and I didn't make it when I should have, and I have been ashamed of that since September of last year. I watched you sit at that table and finish that dinner and I've thought about it every single day since." He paused. He said, "Daniel made his choice. That's his to own. But I want you to know that I watched what you built for us for 5 years, and I saw it, even when I didn't say so, and I'm sorry that I let you be treated as something less than what you were." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Thank you, Gerald." He said, "How are you? Are you well?" I said, "I'm really well, actually." He said, "Good. That's the right answer." There was a pause. He said, "The cabin." I said, "What?" He said, "The Blue Ridge cabin. I'm building it. I finally started. Raymond is helping. I thought you'd want to know, because you're the only one who ever asked about it." Something opened in my chest gently. I said, "I'd love to hear about it sometime." He said, "I'll send you photos when the frame goes up." He did. They were beautiful. I want to be honest with you about what I felt at the birthday dinner, in the full version of it, not just the part where I stood still with the bread basket. I felt the specific humiliation of having your life rearranged in a room full of people who knew before you did. I felt the embarrassment of having worked hard for people who treated my effort as a service rather than a gift. I felt the grief of a marriage, which is not a small grief even when the marriage was imperfect, even when you had half known for months that something was ending. But underneath all of that, I felt something that surprised me. I felt relief. Because what I had understood, sitting in that car in my driveway, was that I had been trying to prove something for 5 years. I had been trying to prove that I was worth keeping. That if I just did enough, organized enough, showed up at enough hospitals and florist shops and Tuesday rehab appointments, I would eventually be let into the room in a way that wasn't contingent on what I could provide. The birthday dinner proved, definitively, that it didn't work that way. Not in that family, not with those particular people. And the thing about learning that something definitively does not work is that you are finally free to stop trying it. Kristen called me 3 weeks after the birthday dinner. She called and she didn't apologize for not calling sooner, which I respected, because she was doing the honest version of the call rather than the performed version. She said, "I want you to know that I told my mother that what she did was cruel. That it was the cruelest way she could have handled it, and I won't pretend otherwise." I said, "What did she say?" Kristen said, "She said she was trying to create a positive moment for the family. She said she'd spoken to Daniel, and he agreed it was a good time." I said, "Of course he did." Kristen said, "I know. I know he did. I'm not defending him." A pause. "I'm still angry at him. I want you to know that." I said, "You don't have to be angry at him on my behalf, Kristen." She said, "I know I don't. I'm doing it on my own behalf." I believed her. She asked if we could have lunch sometime. I said yes, in the abstract way you do when you're not sure if it's a good idea and you want time to decide. She said, "I mean it, Claire. You're not the one who's out of my life." We did have lunch. The following February. A restaurant she chose, halfway between her city and mine. We talked for 3 hours. She told me about the twins and the school situation and her husband and the various complicated things that make up a life. I told her about the partnership track and the house project I was managing that had 15 different stakeholder groups and was the most interesting problem I'd worked on in years. She said, "You seem different." I said, "I feel different." She said, "Lighter." I thought about it. I said, "Like I stopped carrying something I'd convinced myself was mine to carry." She nodded. She said, I should tell you, Daniel and Sylvia got married in November. Very small, just immediate family. I said, I hope they're happy. I meant it, genuinely. This surprised me a little, the sincerity of it. But what I had understood, by February, was that Daniel's happiness or unhappiness was no longer a variable I was responsible for. It was simply something that would be true or not true in his own life, separate from mine. That felt very clean. The following September, 2 years after the birthday dinner, Josephine asked me to lead a presentation at the firm's annual client dinner. The dinner was the firm's signature event, 120 people, and the presentation slot was the capstone of the evening, the thing everyone remembered. I said yes. I spent 3 weeks preparing. I thought about the presentation the way I used to think about the Mercer family gatherings, the organizing, the details, what each person needed to feel welcome and seen. But I did it in service of something that was mine. A body of work I had built. Projects I had run. A vision for what the firm could become in the next decade that I had been quietly developing for 2 years. I stood at that podium in front of 120 people. I was not standing at the edge of someone else's frame. I was in the center of my own. I gave the presentation. Josephine shook my hand afterward with the specific grip of someone who is confirming a decision they had already made. She said, full partner. We'll have the paperwork ready in January. I am not going to tell you that my life became perfect, because it didn't, and that is not what this story is about. What I will tell you is that on a Saturday morning in October, 2 years and 1 month after the birthday dinner, I was sitting in my kitchen in the house that was now entirely mine. With coffee I'd made myself in the particular color and temperature I preferred, looking out at the backyard where I had been slowly building a garden in the way you build things when you are doing them purely for yourself, with no deadline and no guest list. My phone buzzed. A photo from Gerald. The Blue Ridge cabin frame, mid-construction. Pine beams against a gray October sky. Raymond standing in the middle of it, arms out, laughing. And a message, looking good. Thought of you. I looked at the photo for a long moment. Then I sent back, it's beautiful, Gerald. You built something real. He wrote back, a few minutes later, so did you. I have thought about what I would say if someone asked me what I learned from 5 years in the Mercer family and the birthday dinner and everything that came after. I have thought about what it means to be the person who shows up. The one who fills the bread basket. The one who lights the candles and stands slightly outside the frame. I think that people who are good at showing up, people who genuinely love taking care of things and making occasions feel meaningful and remembered, often find themselves in families and relationships where that quality gets used like a resource rather than received like a gift. Not because the people doing the receiving are necessarily cruel, but because if you never show anyone the bottom of the well, they assume it goes down forever. I showed them the bottom of the well. Not on purpose. They found it themselves, the night of the birthday dinner, when they made the single miscalculation of thinking that a woman who had been pouring herself out for 5 years would simply be replaced by the next version of a wife, and that the well would keep being full. It would not. Because the well was mine. And I had decided, sitting in my car in my driveway, to stop giving it to people who were grateful for the water, but had never once looked down to see where it came from. What I want to say to you listening to this, wherever you are, whatever room you're sitting in, is this. You are allowed to stop. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way that makes other people the villains and you the martyr and the whole thing into a performance of your own wrongness. Just quietly. The way I stopped. Setting the bread basket on the table. Saying, excuse me. Walking out of the room you organized, past the flowers you picked up and the cake you paid for and the candles you lit, and finding your own car and driving yourself home. And then, in whatever time it takes, and it takes as long as it takes, don't let anyone tell you otherwise, building something that is entirely yours. Something no one can announce away in a toast at a dinner you planned. Something that doesn't need a guest list or a frame. Something that simply is what it is, because you made it and you know exactly what it cost. That's what I built. And I am still building it. And for the first time in a very long time, I am the only one at the table who needs to know what's in it. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever been the person standing slightly outside the frame, the one holding the bread basket, I want you to know you were never the background. You just hadn't found your stage yet. You will.